What causes war? When we look for explanations, we consider a wide range of factors: greed, revenge, lust, technology, religion, and so forth. Yet I want to make the case that in the modern world especially, the most important factor is philosophy. The famous historian Lord Bolingbroke made this extraordinarily strong claim: history is philosophy teaching by example. And the claim here is that philosophy is our broadest set of ideas, our conception of what reality is like, what the meaning of life is, what we should be pursuing, and as we act on that in our lives, individually and collectively, we make history. So history, the examples of history, or the instances of history, are philosophy in particular. Now, I want to use the 20th century, which was an extraordinarily warlike century, as our case example for testing this hypothesis. So I'm starting here with a list of major 20th century wars: World War I, 1914 to 1918, World War II from 1939 to 1945, the Cold War, typically dated from 1947 on through 1989 and 1991 or so, the Korean War of the 1950s, the Vietnam War of the 1960s on into the early 1970s. Now, all of these are wars that involve large numbers of nations, and also they are, I'm speaking from a somewhat North American perspective here, ones in which the United States was involved, and using the United States as arguably the most powerful nation of the 20th century as a particular point of focus. So here's the list of wars, and I've got them arrayed in a table. Now, let's go on to say why this matters. Obviously, the motivational issue is wars are enormously destructive of human life, human property, human aspirations. And so what we look at in this table is each of those wars and the associated death toll. Now, this is not including injuries, other forms of psychological desolation, and physical property damages, and so forth. These are just the numbers of people killed, both military and civilians, by the war. So 19.7 million people killed in World War I, between 71 to 80 million people killed in World War II. The Cold War, obviously much tension, and there were some deaths, hard to measure, but fortunately it was not a hot war, it was metaphorically a Cold War. The Korean War, though, 2.3 million deaths. The Vietnam War, approximately 3.4 million deaths. So what we're trying to explain then is what led us collectively, the world over, to kill between 96 and 105 million people over the course of the 20th century, these 5 wars. So let's get analytical here. Next step is to say, well, who's involved in these wars? Lots and lots of nations, but if we go to World War I, most prominently involved on one side of the front is Germany, allied with the Austro-Hungarians, allied with the Turks. On the other side, we have the French, the British, the various Commonwealth nations, including Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and then the United States. The United States coming on a couple of years after the war had already begun, and rather reluctantly to get involved in a war that initially they thought did not involve them. Now, we also have Russia here on the list, but I put Russia in brackets, and the reason why I want to bracket Russia, here's the sidebar, is Russia also rather reluctantly got involved in the war. They did have a defensive alliance with France, but they were hesitant to get involved even though they had a formal alliance there. They did have some religious friendly feeling with respect to Serbia, both being Orthodox Christian, and a Serbian had been involved in the triggering event of the war. So Russia reluctantly involved, but also Russia in 1917, before the war had ended, its attentions turn internally because it goes through the communist revolution, and the communists who assume power in 1917 see World War I as a Western war, as a war of capitalist nations. They're not interested in it, and they withdraw from the international war. But then we are left with these as the primary belligerents in World War I. Jumping to World War II. Again, we have Germany on one side of the divide. In this case, though, allied formally with Italy and then allied with Japan. Also, I've got Russia again, and we do, of course, have to say Russia is involved, but I'm putting Russia in brackets, and the reason I want to bracket Russia is two reasons. One is that initially, Russia was allied formally with the Germans. They had a pact to jointly invade Poland and divide Poland between the two of them. Russia would attack from the east, Germany would attack from the west and the north, and they would then formally be allied and take over Europe and divide it between the two of them. But the reason for the brackets then is that a couple of years into the war, once the Germans think they have Western Europe under their control, they backstab or they turn on their allies, the Russians, and they attack Russia. And so at that point, Russia then switches over to the other side of the divide. And then on the other side of the divide, we have the allied nations, France again, allied with Britain, allied with the Commonwealth nations, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, and so forth. And then again, reluctantly, the United States gets involved in the war a couple of years after the war has already begun. And at this point, after the Germans turn on their allies, Russia then switches sides and becomes allied with the nations on the right side of the chart. Next, we jump to the Cold War. This is primarily Russia, now formally called the Soviet Union, against the United States. The Korean War, North Korea, allied with and receiving support from Russia and China. And then on the other side, we have South Korea, formally allied with and receiving material and personnel support from the United States. The Vietnam War, similar story. North Vietnam, allied formally and receiving support from Russia and China. And then on the other side, South Vietnam, receiving support from United States, so on. All right, so what we then have is the 5 wars now, important wars for 20th century history, and an identification of the nations, not all of the nations that are involved, but the primary belligerents in each case. Now let's go on to the next question, which is to ask, well, what kind of nations are involved in these wars? Well, how would we describe their social system, particularly their political, economic way of doing things? And we're trying to explain why these particular nations are allied with each other and why they are opposed to the point of war, various other nations. So on the one side, Germany was an authoritarian nation, a militaristic authoritarian nation at the beginning of World War I. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was an empire, and it also was authoritarian and militaristically organized. The same thing about the Turks. They were an authoritarian nation and also quite militaristic in their policy, foreign policy. On the other side, politically, we characterize France, Britain, the Commonwealth nations like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States as democratic republics, different kinds of democracies, different kinds of republics, various sorts of hybrids, and they are all more or less capitalist, favoring free trade, getting and their foreign policy based on trading with other nations. And so what we then have in World War I is a number of authoritarian, militaristic authoritarian political nations in a belligerent stance with respect to democratic, capitalist, republican nations. Next, World War II. Once again, we have Germany. At this point, Germany is National Socialist. It is strongly nationalistic. It is strongly socialistic. It is formally allied with Italy, which is an explicitly fascist regime, and both of them then are allied with the Japanese, which are an authoritarian, a militaristically authoritarian state. And then on the other side of the debate, again, we have the same parties, France, Britain, Canada, United States, and so forth, and all of them are still democratic republics, free market, capitalist in varying degrees. So what we have in World War II is the nationalist, socialistic, fascistic, authoritarian nations in war against democratic, republican, and capitalistic nations. Jumping to the Cold War, the Soviet Union is explicitly ideologically communist, or we can call that an international form of socialism, and it is in tension with the United States, which is the leading democratic, republican / capitalist nation of the world. If we jump to the North Korean War and the Korean War, North Korea versus South Korea, the Vietnam War, North Vietnam versus South Vietnam. Again, what we have are the North Koreans and the North Vietnamese explicitly want to become more communist, and so that's why they are allied with the then officially communist nations ideologically, and in practice the Russians and the Chinese. And then by contrast, both the South Koreans and the South Vietnamese, they want to be more democratic, more republican, more free market capitalist, and so that is why they are allied with and receiving support from the United States, then still the leading democratic, republican, capitalist nation of the world. So one way then of characterizing the wars that characterize and dominate the 20th century is to say that there are common patterns about which nations are allied with which nations and which nations are opposed to which nations, and that is in part and perhaps significantly explained by the dominant political philosophies of those nations. And what we have is a fairly persistent pattern of democratic, republican, and capitalist nations allying themselves with each other and opposing various authoritarian, various types of socialist, fascist, communist, international socialist regimes. The 20th century then is an ideologically dominated century in terms of its wars. Now, where do these ideologies come from? And this is where I want to turn to philosophy and start to highlight the importance of philosophy. If we think in the modern world of all of the new experiments with democracies, with republicanism, the rise of free market capitalist economic institutions, where did those come from? And when we start to think about the names, the big thinkers who think about politics, who think about the philosophy behind the politics, we start to focus on individuals like John Locke, probably the most influential philosopher of the last, say, 400 years of modern history. John Locke, doing most of his writing in the latter part of the 1600s, writing systematically on philosophy, on ethics, separation of church and state, the importance of religious toleration, the rights of individuals, limitations on political power, separations of powers to some extent, and so forth. John Locke, absolutely central to understanding modern philosophy and modern political philosophy. Free market capitalism, the most famous name in the early modern world, is of course Adam Smith, who published the Wealth of Nations in 1776, the same year that the United States, strongly influenced by John Locke's philosophy, published its Declaration of Independence and became a separate nation. As we get on into the 1800s, the famous classically liberal philosopher John Stuart Mill with his classic work published in 1859 on liberty. So the point of all of this then is to say, if we want to understand nations like Britain, the United States, France, all of them are influenced by Lockean philosophy. And of course, they have their own brilliant intellectuals, such as Voltaire and others, who are bringing these ideas to the French consciousness and altering their culture and so forth. But the giant names here are John Locke, Adam Smith, and John Stuart Mill over the course of these 2 centuries. And what they all have in common is that they are British and that they are philosophers. They are developing comprehensive philosophies to support their classically liberal vision of what society should be all about. The point then is going to be that with these giant names, and of course any number of other brilliant and influential intellectuals, what was going on in British philosophy and British culture is those ideas coming to dominance and shaping its political culture on hundreds and hundreds of issues, including foreign policy. Now, if we go to the other side of the divide and we start to ask, well, all of these authoritarian nations of the 20th centuries, all of the fascist nations, the socialist nations of the nationalist sort or the internationalist sort, where do those ideologies come from? And then again, we start to think of the famous names who generate those ideas. Perhaps the most important name to mention is the philosopher Georg Hegel, who was born in 1770, died in 1831, but in the early part of the 1800s, enormously influential on German culture, and then more broadly on cultures influenced by German culture, and an explicitly collectivistic, authoritarian to the point of militaristic, celebratory, anti-individualistic philosophy by this brilliant and influential philosopher. If we ask about socialism, communism, international socialism, of course, the most famous name to mention here is Karl Marx, who did the bulk of his writing in the middle part of the 19th century. Marx is directly influential on the communist revolutionaries in Russia, in China, in North Vietnam, in North Korea, and so on. And then if we are talking more broadly about adversarial, anti-peace, hierarchical organizations of society to the point of calling for a new authoritarian aristocracy that will enact not merely metaphorical but literal slavery if it feels necessary to achieve its collectivized human improving ends. We have to mention Friedrich Nietzsche, perhaps the most influential philosopher of the 20th century, dying in 1900 at the turn of the 20th century. Now, all of these guys are hugely important, hugely influential names. All of them, what do they have in common? They are German intellectuals, and all of them are, in their important writings, philosophers. Georg Hegel is one of the famous philosophers. Karl Marx had his Ph.D. in philosophy, and while he's mostly known as a political thinker, as an economic thinker, all of his politics and economics are nested within a comprehensive philosophical framework. And Friedrich Nietzsche's Ph.D. was in classical philology, in effect classical cultures centering on the language, but his writings and his publications were deeply philosophical, and his influence is precisely for his philosophy, his metaphysics, his epistemology, his value theory, and his social philosophy. And the point here is that by the time we get to the 1800s, these are the giant names dominating German philosophy, which is the most influential set of philosophical activity going on in the world in the 1800s. All of them are taking German philosophy in a dramatically different direction from the British philosophy that had dominated in the century earlier. And the point then is, if we put all of this together, is one way then of understanding why we end up with the wars that we end up with in the 20th century, World War I, World War II, or the Cold War, the Korean War, is that they are a certain number of nations, prominent nations, that are persistently in collision with each other. And they are in collision with each other because they are instantiations of, or they are trying to put into practice, dramatically different political ideologies. And those political ideologies come out of dramatically different philosophies that are opposed to each other on all major philosophical issues. The one set of philosophical ideas being developed most fundamentally and most influentially by British philosophers from the late 1600s on through the 1800s, and the other developed most systematically and fundamentally by German philosophers through the 1800s on into the 1900s. And so what we have in the 20th century is abstract philosophy that becomes ideology, that becomes instantiated, and the cultural machinery of various nations that then go into physical conflict during the course of the 20th century. So the case here is for philosophy as the most important thing we need to understand why we had wars of the kind that we did in the 20th century. Now, I have a quotation here from John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist of the early 20th century, but a very philosophical economist. And I want to read this quotation through. The ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. So those in authority are distilling what is going on by academic writers in earlier times. Practical people are taking intellectual ideas that they're sometimes unaware of and putting them into practice. And this very strong claim in the second century, the world is ruled by little else, that is to say, economic and political philosophy. Now, another related quote by Ayn Rand, the famous novelist and philosopher of the middle part of the 20th century as well, making a similar claim. Just as a man's actions, she's starting with the individual man, just as a man's actions are preceded and determined by some form of idea in his mind, so a society's existential conditions are preceded and determined by the ascendancy of a certain philosophy among those whose job it is to deal with ideas. The events of any given period of history are the result of the thinking of the preceding period. And then coming full circle to the quote we started with from Lord Bolingbroke, history is philosophy teaching by example.